We seem to have lost Stephen, and so may I, as chair, welcome Carol Leader to this evening's talk. It's a great honour and a great privilege to have her talk to the Blake Society. Carol.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Stephen. Well, thank you very much for asking me to talk about Blake tonight. It always feels a sort of terrifying pleasure to do this because, well, he has so much to say and he's loved by so many people. And it also seems quite a challenge to do it for the Blake Society, because I know that a lot of people watching this tonight are going to have a profound knowledge and also an academic knowledge of Blake. But I came to Blake properly about 30 years ago when I was having a training analysis, a long Jungian training analysis, and also training to be a psychotherapist. And some of the emotional storms that I found myself in were so colossal that I really didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't read, I couldn't eat, I couldn't write. And when I went through these real stormy times, my Jungian analyst, who was also an artist, used to say to me, why don't you go home and look at a picture that you love? And I found myself coming home and looking at William Blake, particularly Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job. And somehow they comforted me, gave me some sort of consolation, extraordinarily, particularly the images of Satan. And I don't know what it was. I think it was something about being brought up in a religious community, or my father was a minister, and always hearing about Blake being so, Satan being so evil. However, I was interested to find out that Blake, I'm actually going to just stop myself because I've got a very funny view of myself where I'm in full view, and I'm going to go on to a gallery view, I think. Yeah, that feels a bit more comfortable. I can see you all. Yeah, and what I was fascinated by Blake was that he called Satan error. And I found that very interesting, error. That made Satan feel more like a mistake. And so I started to pursue Blake a little bit more and find out about him. And I was attracted to Foster Damon, who said that truly he was the Columbus of the psyche, sort of mapping out the psyche a good 100 years before Freud and Jung came along. And here's Foster Damon speaking now. These psychic forces were so real that he had to name them. Hence arose his special mythology, for these forces were living creatures. And I was very aware as I got into the images of Blake and enjoyed them so much, that Jung too, as Stephen has sort of intimated, had a similar journey about 100 years later. He had huge emotional storms after he separated from Freud. And the only way he could sort of control himself in a way was to try and go into those storms and look for the images. Jung famously said, the psyche is image. And this is what Jung had to say about that time of his life. To the extent that I managed to translate my emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images that were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. And I think Blake was doing something like that for me. He was calming and consoling my emotional states, because I felt when I looked at these images in the illustrations of Job, that Blake somehow knew what I was going through. He was doing something very universal that connected to me. And in this way, I became a great friend of Blake. And it was only later that I discovered this quote from Blake. If the spectator could enter into these images in his imagination, approaching them on the fiery chariot of his contemplative thought, if he could make a friend and a companion of one of these images of wonder, then would he arise from his grave. Then would he meet the Lord in the air, and then he would be happy. And I realized that, unbeknown to myself, that's what I'd been doing. I'd been coming home from my analysis in a terrible state, and then often standing in front of the Blake image for probably 20 minutes, not really knowing what it meant or what it represented, but taking the image in and until it became a friend and a companion. So now I'd like to show quite a lot of images this evening, and I'm going to start with the first one. So give me a moment and I'll screen share. Oh, oh, I seem to have lost my, let me see if I can find it again. I just seem to have lost my PowerPoint. Here it comes. Okay, so this isn't from Illustrations of the Book of Job, but it is certainly an incredibly dynamic picture of Satan. And I couldn't find a better picture really to illustrate my talk tonight. Satanic Error and the Curse of Single Vision, Blake's Insights for Therapy and Life. And this startling picture that I think has real emotional impact, well, this is what W.D. Digby wrote about it. All imagination and sensibility, all those promptings of the heart, all understanding which springs from human feeling and sympathy are absent. In this state, the human being is utterly opaque and dark. He is bereft of every glimmer of intuitive insight. And that really is satanic error. As you can see, we're looking at a very split world. There's Satan flying like a bat over Eve, who is wrapped all round by a reptile, by instinct, very powerful, but instinct. And she's sort of comatose, she's strangled really. And tonight I'm going to ask you to look at the images of Blake, particularly in terms of the relationships you can see, because I don't think he was just painting one person. He was painting a kind of relationship. And this is a relationship of error, of single vision. Tonight, I'm going to also accompany some of these images with small quotes from people that I've seen for analysis. And I've changed their names to protect really their confidentiality. But here is part of a dream of Ike. It was his first dream that he brought into analysis. And I think you'll see the parallels with this image. It was of a house with separate doors, but no interconnecting stairs or doors, in which lived on the top floor a robotic, unfeeling scientist, and in the basement a hungry ferret. As the dream unfolded, the ferret somehow escaped and ran open-mouthed towards the dreamer, attaching itself to him with a powerful bite. Now, something potentially liberating was happening here because the bite was causing a connection. But for the dreamer, this illumination was terrifying and produced a ghastly dilemma. What to do with the emergence and escape of this desperately feeling, aggressive and needy animal part of himself? He told me, but I don't want this thing hanging on to me. It repulses me. Now, when I was in training, I found just one or two small technical things happening here. I think I can change it this way. Yeah. When I was in my training, I found another very good view of looking at this from a psychoanalyst, American psychoanalyst called Richard Chesick, who wrote a book called Why Psychotherapists Fail. And I was immediately attracted to that title because being in training, I kind of wanted to know why psychotherapists failed. And Richard Chesick said that if you're going to work as a psychotherapist, you actually need two maps of the mind. One map is an objective map. It's able to do science, it's able to read theory, it's able to understand concept, and that's very important. And I was certainly doing a lot of that during my training. But Chesick says equally important is a non-mechanistic, subjective map of the mind, which represents the unfolding of an unconscious project of the core self. So this isn't objective, it's a very subjective unrolling of unconscious processes in everybody. Well, the individual, if you're in analysis, certainly. And this project of the core self can only really be reached indirectly through using a cipher of transcendence. I think that's a quote from Jasper, the philosopher Jasper, cipher of transcendence. Now, I can't think of anybody better to help me as a cipher to get into something that transcends the objective mind of single vision than William Blake. Because Blake's whole philosophy was about expanding perception. And he wrote this familiar thing, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And of course, these narrow chinks of his cavern are the sensory outlets, the eyes, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and it's limiting everything to those 5 senses. He also wrote very famously, now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. And the person that was going to help Blake with all of this, the internal, well, in a Jungian term, subpersonality, but I think that's really not quite doing this character credit, is Los the blacksmith. And Los the blacksmith represents human imagination. And he has to, in Blake's myths, go many times into eternal death, taking his light, taking the sun, really, the sun of fourfold vision, into eternal death in order to work and image and move error out of error and onefold vision. And he says, I must create a vision. I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. And also, obviously, in using Blake's vocation, but in Los's words, Los says, I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man, inwards into the worlds of thought, inwards into eternity ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. And Jung's idea of individuation is very much about this. It's very much taking a subjective view of each psyche and creating a system to allow everybody to use their human imagination and to individuate so that they achieve their full potential as a human being. But there was Blake really saying this a good 100 years before Jung. We know that Jung had read Blake. I mean, if you go today to visit Jung's home, you'll see Blake books in his library. But I don't think that Jung really studied Blake's complicated mythology. I don't think many psychoanalysts do. I think they more tend to use Blake's brilliant images and then use them to illustrate their concepts, psychoanalytic concepts. And this has always bothered me a bit. I've always wanted to find out really what Blake was trying to say. And I think at the heart of what Blake is trying to say, although he says it in various different ways in various different books, is something about this fourfold vision. So I want to go just a little bit more into detail on that. There's various versions of this for Blake, but fourfold vision involves the fall. And he sees the fall as both the fall in Eden of Adam and Eve out of paradise, but there's also a fall that occurs to his mythological characters, and that's what I'll be talking about a bit more in a minute or two. But once the fall has fallen from paradise, from eternal life, Blake says, the fall takes you into eternal death and into single vision. And single vision, as I've said, represents error in the form of Satan, also in the form of Adam, because Adam is basically an animal man with 5 senses. So both of these are really sort of at the bottom limits in single vision, a very paralleled thin way of experiencing the world. Now, also, Blake calls Satan the accuser, and we'll see that operating a lot in the illustrations of the book of Job. But as I've shown with this quote from Digby, it's a literal unfeeling and functional view of the world that relies purely on our concrete physical senses, and it is eternal death, according to Blake. Then twofold vision, that's going up the scale a little bit. It's seeing through the eye, not with it. It's being able to play with fantasy like poets and artists and analysts do. So, for example, Blake says, that when he sees a thistle in his way, he can also see an old man who he needs to have a fight with. But we can experience this every day, I think. For instance, when we go into a wood and we see trees with strange barks on them, we can automatically see faces. Or sometimes when we look into the clouds, we can see shapes and animals and creatures. Well, I reckon that's twofold vision. It's seeing through the eye imaginatively, not just with the eye at a tree or a cloud. And then we go to threefold vision, which Blake calls Beulah. It's a very peaceful place. It's a place of poetic inspiration. And as I understand it most, it's a place where we dream. And we dream during all the day. It's just that we're not so aware of our dreaming during the day. But when we go to sleep and the ego closes down, then we can often be aware of this dreaming process. And although sometimes dreams can be nightmares, and in a sense, they're not exactly then the mind working in a dreaming way. On the whole, sleep, dreams are there as a place of restoration. And it's also, according to Blake, a place where contraries are equally true. And what he really means by that, and what he could perceive by that, was that our unconscious processes don't have either or. They don't have dead and alive. Now, you know that. You can easily see a person that you haven't seen for 5 years in a dream, or you can see your dead parent in a dream. So what is actually dead in reality in the unconscious is still alive. So there are no real yeses and nos. There aren't any opposites. Contraries are equally true. And finally, we reach fourfold vision, which for Blake in the spiritual form is Jesus Christ, and in the human form, as I've said, is Los the blacksmith. And it's supreme delight. It's eternal life. It's being a part of a greater whole, experiencing being, not just an isolated individual, but being part of the whole of creation. So it's a very inspired and energized place, but we often get to it by taking notice of very small particulars. And Blake was very particular about that. When we try and look at great big things, it all gets a bit messy. But if we go into small particulars, we can often see universal truth. So that's like seeing eternity in a grain of sand, as Blake says. But it does require a lot of mental strife. We don't just get it by lying around. We get twofold vision by lying around and not doing a lot, but we don't get fourfold vision. That really requires something from us, which Blake calls mental strife. But the story behind all of that, behind fourfold vision, is the story of this great, glorious fourfold being called Albion, who Blake first drew. I think he painted this one in his 20s. I mean, it was very much around him all of his life. And Albion, this great being, is carried through eternity by four great powers, which Blake calls four Zoas. And these powers are the powers of reason, emotion, body, and imagination. And Albion is taken through the universe, carried in this great chariot that's pulled along by these powers. But in his myth, in his mythology, the powers start to fall into a power struggle. They start to fight about who's going to drive this chariot. And so they begin to fall apart and not work together as a unity. And here these four powers are. Now this is a diagram that comes from Milton. And as you can see, the four powers are all given names. There's Othona, that stands for the ear or hearing or imagination. There's luva, that stands for the nose, or emotion or smell. Reason, that stands for the eyes and sight. And thymus, that stands for the body and touch, or interestingly, in Blake's terminology, the tongue. And as you can see, right in the middle, you can see single vision as Adam and as Satan. So the fall has occurred. In Milton, that's the fall that's occurred. Now, this bears a striking resemblance to Jung's 4 functions of sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. So once again, there's a real powerful link here that Stephen mentioned. But once again, it's remarkable that there was Blake speaking in this way long, long before Jung came on the scene. And here now is the 4 zoas in collapse. And as the 4 zoas come into separate bits and fragment and scatter, so the chariot can't work anymore, and Albion falls into a deep sleep. And he separates into a feminine part and a spectre. And also his zoas also separate into feminine parts. They've all been joined together before, but now they separate into feminine parts called emanations. And they also separate into spectres, horrible little ghostly things. And you can see them flying around in the sky. So this is part of single vision. There's a lot of separation and splits going on. And who wins this power struggle? Well, it's you, reason. And because everything now is in quite a lot of chaos and things are scattered around, he tries now using his reason to bring order to the world. So here he is with his compass, measuring out the world and creating now one law and one God and one rule. And he's helped along by his own spectre, who happens to be Satan. So here's Satan and Urizen working together in this now fallen universe. But the difficulty of the fallen universe is that everything now is falling into an abyss. Everything is collapsing into nothingness. And Urizen starts to get alarmed and has to call on human imagination, Los, to try and create some structures, some limits to hold this falling, chaotic world. And here's Los, you can see, absolutely terrified. And it is a terrifying thing. I mean, this is a little bit like me sometimes in my analysis that I talked about earlier. And I think Blake at times too, and certainly Jung, how to deal with this chaos, this incredible chaos, how to bring something creative that can hold these terrible moods together. Now, when I was thinking about Blake, I also found great help from the female psychoanalyst Janine Chajouet-Smergel, who's written a lot about creativity and, in her own way, the mental strife that is needed to make emotional states, things that are incoherent and chaotic, into something. And this is just a small quote from her. Creativity is a response to an internal force, which often makes both compulsive and painful the task of finding a space on which to project parts of the ego and objects not assimilated by the ego. So what she's saying here is none of this is in consciousness. There's no shapes or images in consciousness. Everything is chaotic. And so it can become a very compulsive and painful task to find a space on which to make some shapes that bring this whole thing into consciousness. And psychoanalysis actually is a lot about that, as Jungian analysis is too. Now, here's part of the clue that in order to make these shapes, in order to create some limits to this abyss and chaos, Los has to try and work with his spectre. He can't work without his spectre, but the spectre gives him a real hard time. And here's He is lost looking at his spectre, who's howling and wailing and doesn't want to take part in the effort to create something in Loss's forge. But Loss makes him. They do have to find a way of working together. And I think this is a bit what happens in creativity as well. And the interesting thing about Loss's creations is that as he makes things and creates things, which are often artistic, I mean, this is Blake creating his images and poetry. As these things are created, they go into Loss's fire, his blacksmith's fire, and there, error just burns up. It's only truth that survives Loss's fire. So error just goes then. And then that leads the way towards fourfold vision, a loss of single vision and a move towards fourfold vision. But it only starts to happen by Loss and his spectre working together. And I think that's a very interesting point. So let me just do a little recap now on the work of Loss and the human imagination. So Loss has to work hard with these lower limits represented by Adam and Satan. And Adam and Satan represent, well, they live in the forest of error. They live in eternal death. And they represent these low limits, these material limits of contraction and opaqueness. But what has to happen to get to fourfold vision is that the material world or the material matter has to somehow expand itself to become non-measurable, not able to be put into a place by your reason, really. But with Loss's work, contraction can expand into this immeasurable place, which doesn't have limits. If you could imagine this picture, it's just going on and on forever in Blake's idea. Expansion is just expanding into the universe. So contraction goes towards expansion and opaqueness opens up into lucidity or translucence. And that is the feeling of fourfold vision when you're there, if you are lucky enough, when you're lucky enough to get there. It's an expanded, holistic place where one can really think clearly and lucidly with a kind of translucence. And it's often something that's shared. And that the moments when this happens in analysis are really fantastic moments where one is aware that the mind of both analyst and patient are expanding. So Loss's work is regenerative. Creativity is regenerative. Making things, painting, art, all of this subjective project of the core self is regenerative and it creates eternal life. So that's the background really to illustrations of the Book of Job. And so now I'd like to go into illustrations of the Book of Job and see how all of that works out. Because as far as I'm concerned, Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job are the most pure, clear, precise rendition of that mythology that I've just told you in the smallest, briefest terms. And it was his very last piece of work. It was his last completed piece of work, although he'd started painting images from Job in his 20s. So it was something that stayed with him all through his life. And in the pictures I'm now going to show you, I'm also going to include some of the wonderful watercolors that he did of these images before he made the etchings, and he did those for butts. But I'm starting off actually with the first image and the last image of the illustrations of Book of Job, because I'm only going to be using the relevant images for my talk tonight. I mean, there's just too much to show the complete set. And in a way, when you look at these pictures, if you have a good look at the particulars of these pictures, it's a little bit like Spot the Difference. Because what you can see in the first picture is a tree and musical instruments and the sun and the moon. You can see Job and his family. You can see animals lying at the front. There in the second picture, there's the tree, there's the sun and the moon, there's animals, there's Job's family, there's musical instruments. But the first one represents onefold vision, and the last presents fourfold vision. And Blake uses the story of Job. He reinterprets the story of Job. So you get the story of Job, but it's certainly got Blake's reinterpretations in it to show his mythology of this move from one-fold to fourfold vision. Let's just have a quick look at the watercolor of that first one. And as you can see, here is a very sort of immobile image. I mean, look at the instincts, look at the animals, the sheep, they're all laying pretty sleepy on the floor. And the sun setting, this is the last time we really see the sun until towards the end. So it's setting and the moon is coming out and it's night. And as you can see, all the instruments of creativity, all the instruments of spiritual knowledge and creativity are hanging up in the tree unused. And Blake and his children are praying to God. Who is this God? Who is this God that Job is trying to be so good for? What's going on here? What's Blake saying here? Well, Blake makes it very clear in his second etching. Because here, God has just said, look, and I assume most of you know the story, but I mean, it will be self-evident as we go along, that God points to Job, a human man, and says, look, here's my best servant. He's my most loyal man. He's blameless. I haven't got anything to complain about him. And as soon as God says this triggers Satan. And Satan jumps into the scene, and you can see him coming here into the middle of the picture with colossal energy. And he says to God, well, let me test him. He's your favorite. You've never tested him. Let me test him, and I'll soon show you how loyal and good he is. Now, you can see that Blake is talking about Job's inner life. There's a saying, an alchemical saying, what is above is below. What is within is without, and that's certainly true here. So what is above here is within, is going on within Job in the unconscious. And you can tell that from these clouds that Blake puts to surround the scene. And here you see Job at the bottom, opening a book of law or a biblical book, showing the angels that he really knows his stuff. And then at the top, you see, sort of hiding the sun a bit really, is God. And God has also got an open book looking at law or the Bible or books. Who is this God? Who is this Satan? I think Blake is saying this isn't a real God. This isn't, this isn't a real God. This is you reason. This is single vision operating. It's you reason and his spectre, Satan, at work in Job's mind. So, of course, the Bible doesn't say that, but that's what Blake is saying. And, Blake would give these wonderful aphorisms to shock us all. They're brilliant, really. But what's interesting about this image is, I think it's really showing this aphorism that Blake made. Active evil is better than passive good. So Blake is saying that actually this is a better situation than the one we saw in the first image, which is so passive. It's so repressed. It's so uncreative. Now we've got Satan on the scene. We've got a bit of energy coming in. And that's why I think Blake says this is error. It's not evil. It's energy. It's active. And it's better than passive good. Well, God immediately says to Satan, and this is what Blake was so appalled by, really, why a God would say to Satan, to his most favorite person, yes, you do what you like to him. You see how loyal he is. You test him as much as you like, just don't kill him. And that's what Satan starts to do. He kills all of the children off, which I think really is standing for creativity. He kills any chance of creativity. He takes away all the lands, all the crops don't work. And finally, he attacks Job's body. Let's look at the color image of that. Amazing image. And here you can see, I think, a similar image to the one that you saw in Satan exulting over Eve. Here's Satan exulting over Job. And once again, the female is kind of immobile. If you look at Job's hands, and Blake often tells us to look at hands and feet, you can see that Job is rejecting the feminine, and the feminine is just in a terrible emotional state, kept at bay. Now, I'd like to read something here, because often these sorts of scenes, because they're talking about some essential truth, which I think is why Blake is so carries on and why he's so admired, why we're so attracted to him, is because basically he's talking about essential truths of life. And here's Janet, I think, talking about a very similar kind of theme. I see myself alone in a landscape that has been through some sort of devastation. There are stumps of trees and pools of dank water. The sun is hidden under dark clouds. We can see that there, the dark clouds in the corner. Nothing is alive. And although I am not aware of what I have done, I somehow feel responsible for this. It's a terrible place. Well, then arrive the so-called friends, the comforters of Job, to discuss the situation and see what's going on. And we can see it's very clear from how Blake illustrates them that these are no friends. These are just a human example of Satan. They are accusers, and you can see that by these pointed hands. And Blake writes quite ironically, and a lot of writing and images in these borders is telling you a little bit about more what's really going on. So Blake writes, the just upright man is laughed to scorn. And I don't think he's saying the just upright man is any better than the people laughing to scorn. There's something in this dynamic that is wrong, that is error. Let's have a look at the picture again, the coloured picture. Wonderful watercolour where you can really see the expressions going on. And here's this accusatory state. Look at those hands, look at those faces, but also look at this kind of innocence, this upright innocence and open hands of Job saying, but I haven't done anything. I'm sure that my God will sort things out because I'm innocent. I really am innocent. And then on his left-hand side, in a very different position, using very different hands, his wife is saying, what are you doing, Job? This God is just killing everything. What are you doing? I'm going to read another little bit from Peter this time. He knows nothing about Blake, knows nothing about, as far as I know, about Blake's terms of the accuser, but here he speaks in a session with me. This inner voice is so accusatory, I get overwhelmed and completely stuck in a really mad space. I then get caught up in jobs that I can't complete. The whole thing is a self-defeating spiral. You made me smile a while ago. This is me, she's talking to me. When you said, thoughts arrive unbidden. They need to be thought about. They aren't automatically right. Because there was immediately a loud response from inside me that said, but I am always right. You know, I feel such relief just being able to talk about this without being laughed at, which this inner voice is always doing. It's full of contempt. Oh, and even now, I've got to be careful. This voice is listening. It doesn't like me working things out with you. It wants to know why I didn't know all of this before. It thinks I'm pathetic, needing others. Job has reached a real crisis point. In the Bible, it says he had nightmares. But this is Blake's rendition of the nightmare, which is sort of proving his point that you reason and Satan work together. Because here's Job's God. It's both, you reason as a God, but you can see it's Satan because the God, well, let me show you the coloured picture. It's a little bit clearer in the coloured picture. Here you see that God has got a cloven hoof, and wrapped around him is the Satanic Snake, this limiting snake, a snake that only believes in literal things, crawls along the ground. And in this terrible nightmare state, the so-called friends have become devils that are trying to pull now Job down into hell. It's really terrible. And as you can see, Job can hardly bear to see it. And I think as we become more able to see both things within us, a place within us where there isn't contraries, where we can't say, oh, well, I'm good and you're bad, which is projection, which happens a lot. Job in his first single errors was projecting a lot. But when you can no longer do that and say good and bad, or certainly you wouldn't like really good and bad, but good and bad is within me, both of them. It's a very hard thing to really come to terms with. One can do it intellectually, but to really feel it, to know it, is a very difficult thing to experience. So here is Job finding it really hard to look at. And I expect Blake found it hard to look at. We all do. But I think there's a sense that although he's trying not to look, he is seeing. His eyes are open. And then we're taken to a very different scene. A scene which I think is almost after one of these terrible emotional storms. And you see Job sitting, I mean, absolutely exhausted. I mean, I think unable to think or feel or write or do anything. He's just got to try and sit and recover himself. But what's come onto the scene is a young man, and this young man is bringing new information. He's talking about dreams, and you can see in the margin below, Job is lying down, and he's not having a nightmare. He's dreaming. His thoughts are taking him to Beulah. As you can see, they're rising up into the margins, up to the top. So he's moving up now towards fourfold vision. It's becoming possible in his mind to experience something very different. And then he starts to perceive in a different way. I'm just going to use the watercolors for this, all very familiar to many of you, I would have thought. But he starts to move into fourfold vision. He has 4 angels, no longer the sun, 4 angels singing, which is Blake's vision of the sun. And the God, which still looks very much like Job, is nevertheless bringing the opposites together. You can see the sun and the moon under the God's eyes. And now everybody is starting to be able to look. Job, even the so-called friends, and his wife. But what seems very important, and this is in the Bible, but much more profound, I think, from Blake, is that also God is asking them to look into the depths of the human psyche, to looking into the most aggressive and blind areas that we all contain within us. And now the concentration is really intense. Have a look at all of their eyes, Blake and Job, his wife, and the angels and God. They're all looking at this very deep, unknown, or almost dragon-like power, because that's the truth. This has got incredible power. And when this is locked up, off from experience, one can't experience the energy within it. And now it's time for what Job calls a final judgment. Because when error is seen through, when you are no longer seeing through error in a very literal way, you experience a final judgment. And this isn't a one-off thing. It can be experienced in a psychotherapy session. It can be experienced in a really good talk with a friend. And what happens then is that all the error, the single vision, goes straight into Los's fire. And there's Los's fire at the bottom. And you can see Satan going into the fire along with the identifications of Job and his wife. You see, Job and his wife have been identified with Satan. And that's what Blake is showing to us. So their figures going into the fire as well. But their actual beings can stand back now and see what's going on. They've got a position now in their vision where they're not all in it as in single vision and ignorant and blind. They're able to see what's going on. And I want to give, over this painting, I want to give Blake his own words. Oh, glory. Oh, delight. I have entirely reduced that spectrous fiend to his station, whose annoyance has been the ruin of my labours for the past 20 years of my life. This is Blake speaking in his 40s. I was a slave bound in a mill among beasts and devils, and these beasts and these devils are now together with myself, become children of light and liberty. And my feet and my wife's feet are free from fetters. Now we immediately see a huge change in the way people are relating. That single vision relating has gone. And what we get is true relationship between human beings. And in this picture, Job is able to receive from others. And that's a huge step forward for the righteous man, because the righteous man has to give to everybody. He doesn't receive, he doesn't take stuff into his own heart. So here he is now receiving something from his friends, and his friends are done in really exquisite beauty by Job. So things have become beautiful now. And now Job is also able to pray for his friends. He's able to give something to his friends. And we see in the clouds, which is the inner life, this isn't any longer blocked by an odd god called you reason. You just see the full energy of the sun, which is representing fourfold vision. Job can see. He starts to see. Then the penultimate illustration in the illustrations of the book of Job is this one where finally Job becomes reconciled to the feminine. And here's the feminine gathered around him. And this means he can become creative again. He's no longer split off from his inspiration, from what the feminine in Blake's mythology brings to the masculine. And this means that Blake's state of mind can now carry things within his mind. See the pictures behind Job? He can carry his memory. He can carry what he's been through. He doesn't have to act it out. He can think about it. He can reflect on it. He can learn from it. He has become creative, and he's surrounded, you know, in the borders by musical instruments. So on to the final picture, which I will just use the watercolor for. And as you can see, this image is full of sound. It's full of noise. It's energetic. It's fourfold vision. And everybody now has taken the instruments off the trees. The sun is now rising again. The sons are playing musical instruments, as are Job and his wife. And the daughters are holding scrolls that represent literature and poetry and the arts. And let me again let Blake have the very final word, really, of this talk. There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. And for Blake, this is the necessary work of human imagination in every human being. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We now have an opportunity for questions. And as Stephen advised at the beginning, if you could raise your hand under the reactions button, if it's on your version of Zoom, to ask a question, then because we have many people in the meeting, it's easy to identify who wishes to ask the first question. Ramazan.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I've been reading Jung's Red Book now after our last session, and I'm so excited to see these parallels between them. And in your presentation, I saw something in Job Plate 1. If you look under the sun, you can see the Gothic architecture, which is eternal life for Blake. And when you look under the moon, there are pyramids, which are mathematical forms, which are just material forms. So when you look at the last plate, these structures are no more. We can only see the people and natural world, or just a pastoral background. So I think these work into your analysis as well, because living form and mathematical form, they all factor into this psychic drama, I think.
That's a wonderful point, Ramazan. Thank you very much. And what you're bringing out too is the colossal detail and that Blake brings to these particular illustrations. I first got to know it through Andrew Solomon, who wrote a long time ago a book called Blake's Job, A Message for Our Time. But I still find it a great book. It goes into real detail, not quite that detail actually, Ramazan, but I mean, what's wonderful is once you start to get to know the pictures, you then start to notice details yourself that other people haven't noticed. And that's where Blake is working from these really minute particulars to show universal truths. So if people want to make a start, I couldn't make a better recommendation, I don't think, than Blake's Job, Andrew Solomon, although other people might have other recommendations, but that simply goes through illustrations of the Book of Job.
Thank you. I haven't read that, so I will just buy it. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Sometimes it takes a little while for questions to bubble up. But does anyone have an immediate question they'd like to ask?
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hello. My name's Catherine.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi, thanks very much for this talk. I was riveted the whole way through.
Good.
I find my attention drawn to the Jehovah, your reason, God. And I'm wondering if I'm feeling uncomfortable with this idea that he's totally reduced to your reason and that he disappears completely in the process of transformation and growing up of consciousness. And I wonder if he might not, in fact, be a sort of messenger from an overriding God who's a bit behind the scenes, a more universal God. I wonder if you'd reflected on that at all, on the real nature of this God. It's a very confusing figure.
But I think that's perhaps what Blake is saying and what Ramazan has just said, that actually when you reach a spiritual state, those sort of pictures are not so important somehow because you have reached, well, as you're saying, the God or spirituality behind any image we want to give it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what Blake is trying to say. I don't know if that answers your question at all. Yes, he's sort of saying God isn't in the sky. It's a spiritual force.
Yes. I guess I'm seeing it as this process of becoming, of individualizing, or Jung's term is a different one. But yes, this thing that almost there's a splitting, but that this has to be done. It's part of the evolution of our development, and there's a sort of God of that going on. But,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. And you know, I think that Blake would say that there's an evolution going on in each individual soul or spirit. There's an evolution going on in the world outside, because look at what that Eurasian God can do outside. I mean, the concrete gods in certain religions can be, can just be killers, really. And one then feels that perhaps the real spiritual fourfold understanding of what is beyond measurability is somehow being lost. So I think we are absolutely, as a humanity, going through evolution in terms of this. And interestingly, Jung has something to say about this as well, that he talks a lot about the psyche being in subpersonalities. So another way of looking at Blake's mythology is to say that he's able to draw all these subpersonalities that he sees. But as time goes on, Jung says these personalities lose their personhood. They become functions. You almost integrate them. And then you actually dream less sometimes, because they become more part of you. They become more integrated in you. So the personality starts to fade. And I think that's what you see something in the sort of loss of those individuals, Satan and God and so forth, in the final pictures of illustrations of the Book of Job.
It's all sort of no longer needed.
That's right, that the mind or the spirit or the development is developed. It's no longer needed.
Perhaps they can be seen more in the pictures of the sun rising at that point.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And now we have a question from Michael Adoki.
Hello. Sorry, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, Michael, I can.
Hi. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I was cooking while I was doing that and I came in a bit late, so I was a bit flustered, but all that I caught was really, really amazing. So thank you. I missed the beginning part. Did you say you were a psychoanalyst? Is that what you said? You were a psychoanalyst?
I'm a Jungian analyst. I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst. That means I particularly think in Jungian terms as well as Freudian terms, because there was this split between Freud and Jung. And so there is a tendency for Freudian psychoanalysts not to think about Jung, whereas a Jungian psychoanalyst will be thinking about Jung and Freud.
No, that's weird.
In a way, that's
yeah.
there.
That's as I can say. It almost felt like the gods within Blake's universe, how they split and some recognize the whole, where some only focus on the minor. And what I want to ask you, first of all, I like the idea when you spoke about subpersonalities. I'm a teacher and we was watching Inside Out. It's an animation for young people, which literally talks about the inside of the mind, where you have these different subpersonalities. You have happiness, fear, and I thought that was quite a good analogy. And what I want to ask you was, I'm not sure if this is a personal question, but in your experience, do you look at Blake, and I ask this because I go to so many of these talks, I always wonder, what does the person who is presenting, what do they think? Are you looking at this from an analytical point of view, or is it a spiritual point of view? Is it poetic? Like, what is your angle with this? Is it more intellectual, or is there a spiritual element when you look at Blake? Sorry if that's personal, but I always find it quite interesting.
I don't mind you asking that at all. It's just a very big question. Just give me a mo, just let me collect my thoughts there. I mean, I think the work of depth psychologist is, for most analysts, is about trying to find the truth, whatever we mean by the truth. And I don't mean sort of like, I've got the truth and you haven't, but sort of the truth about being a human being. And I think individuation is about that, but I think Freudian analysis can be about that. It's sort of like asking these big questions. Who am I? What's life about? Why can't I relate to people very well? What's the meaning of what we're doing here? That's what I would call these questions concerning truth. So it's a hard question to answer, really, because I certainly don't just see it as a scientist or as an intellectual pursuit. I don't think that's what analysis is about. I think it's what Chesick says. Perhaps you missed this bit.
Okay.
I was talking about the psychoanalyst Chesick that says you need two maps of the mind, a map that allows you to see objectively, but also a map that allows you to think about subjective experience and to be able to use what he says, ciphers of transcendence, to be able to use certain things that help your mind to transcend to, we could say, outside of our everyday experiences, which is still true, but our actual physical eyes can't see them, but our inner eye can see things. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's
it kind of does. It's definitely a difficult question. So sorry to put you on the spot, but it kind of does, and I do think you have answered it really well. So thank you.
Next, might I ask Eric Nicholson? Eric Nicholson, I understand you can't technically raise your hand, but here you are. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Recently, I said to a friend who'd taken an overdose, he's in his 80s, and he was offered some psychotherapy, and I was encouraging him to take this offer because, as you know, it's quite rare to get that, especially on the NHS. And he was poo-pooing it, saying, you know, he didn't see what help it could provide. And I was trying to just say, well, a psychologist can act as a sounding board, and most of us don't really know our minds as well as we think we know. This is all a lead up to a question about, do you see any equivalence between psychotherapy and, for example, Buddhist training? I mean, I'm a Buddhist, so I've sat facing a wall for 35 years, and it's certainly, what's the phrase Blake uses? Mental strife. And I see a great similarity between, I told my friend that I have psychotherapy, but it's self-psychotherapy. It's Buddhist training. Would you agree? Because you have to confront all your fears.
Well, yes, I'm only thinking because
all the dark areas of one's psyche.
And you do that a lot on your own, but basically, if you're going to train as a psychoanalyst and a psychotherapist, you have to work with another. And probably that's different than Buddhism. So you have to work with another mind. But I think, like your practice, that is mental strife. Because in a way, I think probably the 80-year-old couldn't see the value of opening his mind to another mind. In other words, his mind was closed to that. And I think, and when we look at the story of Job, we see somebody who starts out with a very closed mind. And there has to be some really shocking stuff to get that mind open. And I think what I understand you saying is, sitting and looking at a wall, your mind is put through incredible labor to get to different levels of the mind. And I think the way that this happens a lot in psychoanalytic training is you have to be with another and you have to open your mind. When you close it, you know, it's interpreted. Somebody will say to you, hang on, what's going on here? You know, you're just going off into another subject, come back and answer my question or whatever. So I think that's another very different way, but another way of opening a mind.
So would you say that the outcome is very similar because it's to do with integration?
Yeah, all being well, it's very similar. I mean, I mean, I suppose it's the same with Buddhists. It's then what happens to your mind. I mean, all being well, your mind can grow. Your mind starts to grow. Sadly, that doesn't happen with everybody, because presumably it doesn't happen with Buddhism, because with some people, because there has to be actually something that's going on inside that starts to bring the mind alive so that it can. And what I'm saying, what I think that Blake discovered was there's something about working with Satan, with error in the mind, that actually is the furnace. It's actually something that helps the mind to grow.
Yeah, somebody else came up with this phrase, the crucible of transformation. I don't know where that actually came from, but that very much resonates with my Buddhist practice. But it's not a lonely, it's not a solitary practice, although there's that aspect, because you've got the Sangha, which is your fellow Buddhists. So
that's right.
You're not doing it sort of going off into a mountain or living in a cave.
No.
It's very, you can use other Buddhists, if you like, as sounding boards. But
well, and I suppose what's important is we're saying, and I think Blake would say, truth is in many different forms. Truth can have many different ways of being told, and we all have to find our way. I mean, that's why, you know, He Is Lost says, I have to create my own system. We can't do another person's way. We have to find what is meaningful for us. So, you know, I really appreciate Buddhism is the thing that has opened your mind. Psychoanalysis has opened mine.
Yeah, Blake as well. I'll just finish off by showing this book as well. Joseph Wicksteed.
Yes. I mean, I've not got a wonderful copy like that. I've got a small copy, but that's a wonderful copy.
I recommend that to anybody who hasn't read it.
Yes.
Absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
And now could I call upon Jennifer Jesse?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. At the very beginning of your talk, you talked about the power of these images to communicate with us, even though we don't understand the meaning. You know, go home and look at a picture you love. I'm curious, do you ever use any of Blake's images in your practice? When you're treating someone, does an image pop in your mind and you think that would be particularly therapeutic for your patient?
Well, I don't tend to. It's not that that would be against what I might do, but I don't tend to, because in a way I'm trying to encourage the person to find their own system. So there isn't a tendency in psychoanalysis to talk too much about other people's theories. Even Jung, I don't talk a lot about Jung. They're informing my mind, if you see what I mean. But in my consulting room, I have got 2 Blake pictures. I've got a little tiny one of the Vision, you know, the poet sitting in the little room. And I've got the Arlington Court picture, which actually I brought into my office today to bring me good luck, which is over there. But that's usually in my consulting room. So people can ask me about the pictures I've got up. I mean, most Jungians have quite a lot of art or things around in their consulting room.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. The next question comes from the artist Diane Eagles.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, Carol. I am an artist. I'm also an art psychotherapist, and I'm really interested in how Blake managed throughout his life to form his thinking without having an analyst with him. And as you were explaining earlier, how it is a very difficult process to reflect when you don't have someone to reflect with. It's a very lonely and very arduous process. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and whether for Blake his art was his reflective medium.
Well, definitely. And I mean, really, until I think really 100 years ago, there wasn't this type of work. I mean, there were different things. You could go to church and there were all sorts of spiritual practices, but this close working with another person, I think is a product of the 20th century. And I think it is an evolution where people don't have to do it. What we know about now, child development, we know that certain aspects of a baby's mind cannot develop without another person. So there's something highly developmental about working closely with another to do certain things. But of course, before 100 years ago, people didn't have that, and that included Jung too. So Jung didn't have an analyst. So when he was in this terrible state, he had to, as I read, go into his own images like Blake. And that produced, you know, the red book that now many people that are interested in Jung knows about, because very similar to Blake in a way, it's got odd mythological writing that's quite hard. You have to work at it because he's writing out of the unconscious process. He's not writing out of the ego. So it comes across as odd until you get to know it. And equally, in the red book, he also draws, he painted, he imaged a lot, because as I say, he really felt that the first feeling of the unconscious as it rises up in us tends to come through image. You know, that's why dreams are so important, because in a way our emotional feelings and states are coming into consciousness through image. So it's like a bridge, really. I don't know if that said enough to your question, but
it does. Yeah, I'm very curious about the creative process and how it enables something to emerge and develop within our minds. Yeah, I obviously I'm a little bit biased as an art psychotherapist about.
Well, I guess process. I am too. I guess I am too.
Yeah.
But you find your way, haven't you? It's not everybody's way. And, you know, I don't think psychotherapy is everybody's way. But certainly it was a tremendous help to me. It opened up something for me when I first went into Jungian analysis. Within 3 weeks, well, in the first 2 weeks, I was terrified. I started to get visions, which was very, very frightening for me. Seeing things on the wall and seeing, you know, going through that. But actually, very quickly, I started to understand my dreams. And then very quickly, I started to understand poetry in a very different way. And I was an actor. My first career was as an actor. So I felt that I'd got a symbolic function. I could work very well with twofold vision. I could understand symbolism. But there was something about doing analysis and working steadily with somebody else that made me understand poetry in a totally different way. It sort of embodied it more for me, which is very Blakean, isn't it? He's sort of saying you can't do it all from reason. You've got to get all of these forces of your body, the four zoas, back until you can sort of get Albion really working. And I think he's talking about the world as well as us as individuals.
And I think it's interesting as well that it isn't just the art for Blake. I should qualify that, because obviously there's poetry,
yes,
and there's music in there too, and
absolutely,
and all of the arts play a part. It isn't in isolation. Yeah.
Thank you, Diane. Next, we have Pauline to ask a question.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk. It was really interesting. I am personally highly interested in the relationship between psychology and literature. Therefore, it was really amazing for me. And I have a question in relation to the pre-Freudian period in psychological methods and Blake's poetry or illustration, or Blake's work in general. Can we define, do you think, Blake's work as maybe introspective? I mean, is there a relation between Blake's works and introspection as a psychological method, especially within the context of the 19th century? I mean, have you come across any information regarding Blake and his interest in the introspective method, or are there any relations between introspection and psychotherapy or psychoanalysis? I know my question is, I guess, two-folded, but perhaps you could answer them both.
Well, I haven't come across it, but I mean, I know we'll have a lot of experts, Blakean experts online, but I haven't come across, I mean, Blake was brought up and studied alchemy, and he studied at Swedenborg a lot. He was quite into certain visionary religious early movements, but I don't think this whole idea in this term that you're talking about came into play really until the 20th century. I mean, certainly Jung created this idea of extrovert and introvert, the idea that there could be people that were naturally out in the world and wanted to be with people, and other people that naturally needed to go inside and find an inner world inside, which clearly is true of Blake. But what's interesting with Blake is you can hardly say Blake had an awful childhood. He actually, by all that seems to be clear is he had a pretty good childhood. So this supports what Jung felt, that introvertism, unlike what Freud felt, introvertism isn't an illness. It's just you're just a different sort of person. And a great deal can be got out of introvertism. But equally, if you happen to be an extrovert, you may want to go it that way. Now, what's interesting about my life was, I think I sort of started out using my extrovert, you know, standing on stage, doing television, presenting things. But what happened for me in the second half of my life was that I seemed to go into a very introverted period. And now I suppose I'm a bit more of a balance, but certainly more introverted than I was. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but if it doesn't, please say it again, because I know there'll be experts that probably could give you, but I don't think that Blake did. I mean, I just think he was him. He just did his stuff. Really.
Thank you so much. This answers my question, at least partially. And the reason why I asked this question was a keyword that you used, subjectivity. I mean, this subjectivity in his works reminded me of, I mean, there was a free association there actually in my mind, which, I mean, that word reminded me of introspection as a method, which is a method to look within for maybe those who are not aware of it. That's why I asked my question. Thank you so much.
I mean, I have to say, obviously, meditative practice and introvertism has gone on for centuries. But I think this talking about it in this way, including subjective experience, is quite a modern, you know, it doesn't relate to what's actually really been going on for centuries, really.
I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pauline. Now, can I invite Stephen Pritchard from the Mountain to ask a question?
I may not get to finish this question. Well, it's not a question, really. I was just thinking about Blake and the idea of an analyst. I don't know, I seem to have frozen. Yeah, I was just going to say that Catherine Blake, I think, must have been incredibly important to Blake, supporting him in his art at points where no one else believed in him. And letter writing to his friends, too, was another way that he, I think, expressed, he did talk about what he was going through at points in terms of wrestling with his spectre, writing to Haley even, and through his art, of course. So, yeah, ways in which Blake works his problems out through those people. But without Catherine Blake, I think he might have had a very different fate.
I think that's a really good point, Stephen, because I mean, although he had difficult times with Catherine Blake, what we do know is she sat up with him through the night, and in a way that is acting a bit. I mean, it isn't acting like a therapist, but in a way it's being another there for him, and him not having to be alone, facing all of his visions and all of his states of mind, which clearly, when you look at the amazing images, my God, his mind had to tolerate a lot to let those images come into play and then to draw them.
I imagine she did a lot of listening.
I think you're right. I think she did. You might not get that sort of wife these days.
Thank you, Carol. Really enjoying the talk. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Stephen. And now can I invite Holly Cornell to ask her question?
Hi, Holly. Can you unmute?
Okay, here I am.
Oh, hi.
I'm welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm from California. Love to be here.
Could you put your video on? Could you put your video on, Holly?
It's not working today.
Oh, okay.
But the lady who spoke before was talking about an interesting subject. I found a book a while back called Blake and a Psychology Study by W.P. Whitcutt. That's W-I-T-C-U-T-T. And he does talk about the introverted intuition and about the imagination in nature. And that's how I found Blake and Jung, is through the imagination and being close to nature and seeing them as friends that way. And so that's how I learned about them. Even though I'm working with a Jungian therapist now, I'm delighted. All the images are such good friends that you brought up today, but you took it to a next level. You affirmed that connection in me, and seeing other people understanding that is such a joy. I can't tell you how happy I am. And just the last thing I want to say is, within this book, it describes Blake as a young child. He was originally his family was from Ireland, and they moved to Middlesex, England. And there was a description of his father who said he would see him play with all the little boys, all with lovely blonde hair, and there was Blake with his fiery red head and locks. He said it was so delightful. Anyway, so I don't have any questions, but I just felt the need to share that.
Could you just give us the book title again? I'll check it out.
Blake, A Psychological Study by W.P. Whitcutt. It was published in, I think, 1946. It's a little book. I found it at a local dealer. It was published in London, Halls and Carter, 1946.
Okay,
and he does get into the four zoras, as you just explained, and the imagination. It's just a beautiful little book. It really opened up, it expanded my mind.
Lovely.
Well, thank you again. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Holly, for your question. I'm looking at the raised hands. I think for the moment we've answered all the questions that are there. I wonder if I might just ask something myself, Carol. You focused your talk rightly through the book of Job. And as you pointed out, there are the coloured illustrations that Thomas Butts commissioned. And also right at the end of the life, there's the engravings that John Linnell commissioned. And I always find myself a slight prejudice that the engravings are very beautiful and very technically amazing, but they are black and white and a little bit single visioned. Whereas the illustrations seem to be at the opposite end, they're fourfold visions. And I just wondered if Blake was playing a game right at the end of his life by saying that, look, here I can take the single vision of a black and white engraving and give you fourfold vision through it.
Huh. Well, it's a wonderful thought. I mean, I know what you mean by the coloured visions, the coloured things. And when I've done similar talks before, my husband always says, oh, include a lot of the colour. They're great. And they are great. I mean, particularly the one of the accusers. I just think it's extraordinary. But I do have to say that when I was in that strange state, I found the black and the colour was too much for me. I found that the black and white ones sort of focused me, and it was like being able to look at small particulars. But I wouldn't put it past Blake to be having a joke.
Then on behalf of the Blake Society, can I thank Carol Leader for a very wonderful talk. Carol spoke to us some years ago, and it's always a great pleasure to have her bring her studies and her love of Blake to our meeting. And so on behalf of everyone, I thank Carol, and I'm going to close the meeting. So thank you very much indeed, and good night, everyone. Our next meeting will be in August, when, with the government restrictions on COVID being raised, we're going to gather at Blake's grave in Bunhill Fields. More information on our website.
Great.
So thank you to everyone, and
good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.